Hi, everyone. I'm here to introduce today's guest, Dr. Anthony Muhammad, who is an author and international thought leader. He currently serves as the CEO of New Frontier 21 Consulting, a company dedicated to providing cutting edge professional development to schools all over the world. He served as a practitioner for nearly 20 years as a teacher, assistant principal, and principal. Dr. Muhammad is recognized as one of the field's leading experts in the areas of school culture and professional learning communities at work. Let's get to the episode.
I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-created curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Dr. Anthony Muhammad, welcome to the Time for Teachership podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here, and I appreciate you providing this platform for me to share some of my thoughts with your listeners.
Yeah, I'm really excited, particularly because I just read The Way Forward, which is a recent book that you wrote, and it is wonderful. I have so many questions about it, but I want to start off the show with the first question I ask all the guests, which is in line with freedom dreaming. Dr. Bettina Love describes it beautifully as dreams grounded in the critique of injustice, which I love. What is your big dream for the field of education?
Is that we truly appreciate the beauty of each individual human being. And schools, public schools, are rather recent experience. There's always been schools, but one of the old adages is that you never educate the poor. So people have been restricted from getting their gifts and talents cultivated based upon income or gender or race or language or ethnicity. And public schooling was a very progressive step in breaking down those barriers. But yet, as we know, just because you break down barriers legally doesn't mean it breaks down people's hearts. And by law, every child in America has a right to attend school. But as we know, their experiences tend to differ based upon who they are, where they lived, how much money their parents have in the bank, or the color of their skin. My dream is that we would really see the beauty of each individual and make our institutions calibrate them around bringing that out, with comparing them and ranking them and being vitriolic because a student doesn't do what we expect them to do. You got one life, and school can help make that life more pleasant if we change our paradigm.
I love that response. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. What a beautiful opening to this conversation. I think one of the things that I really love about your book is that several things I love. One is that you use this idea of like the PLC at work framework to ground what's happening currently and what has been happening since the pandemic, to highlight exactly what you just said and how it's just not been happening, not just historically, but like the pandemic was this beautiful opportunity to do things different. And, how have we actually done things differently, right? So, I think one thing that I think maybe to start with is for folks who maybe are unfamiliar with the PLC at work process, do you mind just giving us a brief overview, maybe like the critical tenets or something of just what's that framework? And then we can dive into kind of the specifics of your book.
Absolutely. I want to give your viewers kind of a little history lesson, because my mentors, Rick DeFore and Robert Aker, who are the architects of the PLC at work process, did not invent the concept of PLC. The concept actually had its birth with the research of Peter Senge and the book, The Fifth Discipline, and the concept of learning organizations. And then Thomas Sergiovanni, who was an education professor, was not enamored with the concept of organization. He said that that's too corporate. It's a little bit too cold, and its schools are much more moral. And he coined the phrase learning community. And Shirley Hord and Milby McLaughlin, who were both education professors, felt that it's nice to have a group of professionals learn together, but the whole focus is to improve professional practice. They coined the phrase professional learning communities. Rick DeFore and Robert Aker took that foundation to the next level in 1998 when they wrote a book called Professional Learning Communities at Work, when they asked, if you have a group of professionals who are learning and working and growing together, what would their work look like if they were doing it at an optimal level? And that's where the PLC at Work process came in, and they framed the work of the collaborative organization around what we call our six tights, what we call a PLC right. They would make a decision that learning would be the focus of the organization. And we'd focus on the development of every child, and we do it together as opposed to separate. Tight or tenet number two would be, in order to do that, every member of the system will need to be a part of a strong collaborative team, whether it's an administrative team or a team of teachers or counselors who focus on their component of student learning. What would those teams do? Tight number three is that they would clarify down to a granular level what every student would need to learn. So if we're on an algebra team, Lindsay, and we're trying to improve our students' proficiency in algebra, what would that proficiency look like in Unit 1 for every child? Marzano would call it a guaranteed and viable curriculum. The fourth tenet would be, once that's been determined, then that team would frequently develop formative assessments, common formative assessments, to gather evidence on students' progress, to inform individual and collective practice, and to move to the fifth tenet, use that evidence to figure out who needs extra time and assistance to meet those guaranteed targets, and who would be ready for enrichment or extension. And then finally, we would agree that we would trust the evidence from this process to improve individual and collective practice. And that's PLC at Work in a nutshell. It's not just meeting and talking about random professional topics. It would be a very specific set of work that teams would engage in and an institution would engage in that's focused on mastery and essential learning targets for every student as determined by the collaborative team. So that's PLC at Work in a few minutes.
I love it. Wow, that was really distilled. It was beautiful. And I love too in the book how you distinguish PLC right from PLC light. And I specifically love that you name, like, it's PLC light is implementing only what doesn't make them uncomfortable, right? So this idea of discomfort as necessary for like true equity and truly centering and seeing like what are we doing and what can we do differently and what is that impact on children is so amazing. Like I really like how you frame that. And I love how the PLC at Work process really gets down to like, what is it actually that we are doing? And how do we keep student learning in mind? Like the curriculum is very tied to the PLC. We're unpacking the data of the student learning. We are unpacking all of this stuff. And it's not some like, fluffy, let's all like get together and talk about a topic.
Yes. And that will be more what we consider a critical friends group.
Yep.
Which isn't bad. It just doesn't have the same evidence from research and the impact of student learning. There's nothing wrong with teachers getting together and discussing topics of practice. But if you're really interested in improving student learning, it wouldn't be random, it would be intentional.
I love that. And so I'm going to shift now because I'm wondering about the research that you did in terms of the impact on students and educators that COVID had. There were so many things in here that I found fascinating. And I mean, you even took, like Hattie's effect sizes when schools are closed research. You talked about teacher satisfaction. You talked about the impact on students' mental health. I mean, all sorts of things. What was most interesting to you, most surprising to you as you were doing that research?
That chapter was the most emotional one for me because you could sense it just from observation that things were different. But to dive into the evidence and the research on how basically pausing society for 2 years with uncertainty, with fear, with even the battle of ideologies that emerge politically, and then telling people to leave the cave after 2 years of hibernation and saying, ready, set, go. And then wondering why people aren't as enthusiastic or as engaged. But one of the things that really intrigued me, there's several things on educators, was our history of not acknowledging our own mental health and how COVID made us, in a way, start to acknowledge it. But there was a recent Education Week poll done on buzzwords in education that educators find unpleasant. Unfortunately, in that list of the top 10, self-care was one of them. That I don't want us to become so altruistic that we forget that we matter. If the teacher's stressed out, if the teacher's anxious or depressed, then what impact do you expect that person to have on children who are also anxious and depressed and stressed out? And what really bothered me is the lack of our top leadership at the state, the federal, at the district levels, their willingness to acknowledge that. There's nothing wrong with taking a step back and thinking about how our institution, what it's doing to the mental health of our educators and to our children. It's okay to pause for a minute and recalibrate for a better future, as opposed to, we got to catch up, learning loss, we need more time, we need after school. And you're just taking depression and anxiety and you're just enhancing it as opposed to addressing. And sometimes, Lindsay, I feel sometimes lonely because I feel like I'm screaming in the wilderness to people things that seem like common sense, and it's just not registering. I see teachers being pushed over the edge, and we are in one of the greatest teacher shortages in American history. The data screaming at us. The teachers we have are by and large dissatisfied and depressed. We're not attracting new people to the profession, and people are quitting wholesale, but yet we haven't shifted our approach. I was also taken by the impact it has had on children, uh, particularly in states that did long-term virtual, and the real gaps that have developed. Just last week, there was a report on the New York Times that chronic absenteeism has more than doubled since COVID. So kids are becoming more school phobic. For 2 years, they were on a computer. And sometimes they logged in and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they found the lessons engaging, sometimes they didn't. And to see that that impact was greater in a negative sense for kids of poverty, who we didn't think about, if there are 5 children, are there 5 laptops in the home? Are there 5 quiet places for them to engage? Is the bandwidth adequate for them to stay engaged? What are the distractions that are happening at home? Are they facing homelessness? And then you add that on top of that, something that really hurt my heart was that for kids of poverty, the gaps were larger and their anxiety and depression. And for LGBTQ students who had to witness on the news these adult debates about whether they even exist or deserve to be acknowledged. So that chapter was, it was emotionally, it took an emotional toll on me, to write it, synthesize it, and then publish it.
I'm sure it was emotional even just to read. I mean, yeah, that I had written down that exact thing as well. Just the increased anxiety and depression around girls and LGBTQ plus youth were impacted possibly with a social media like mediator influence. I thought that was fascinating, right? Because it's the news. It's also the conversations that are happening with their peers that we like usually don't touch in education, right? That Black boys were placed in special education at an increased rate of 20%. I mean, just like mind-blowing things where we're just doing things worse, like things are happening worse. Like we're not pausing, like you said, and recalibrating. And it's so necessary. I think the 12% was the teacher job satisfaction rate that was reported. I mean, that's almost single digits. Like there's a problem.
Yeah. Now it did go up to 20%
Okay.
last year. Ooh. Now only 80% of teachers hate their job. So
Ooh, that's rough. Yeah. Oh my goodness. And so as we think about, all of the pieces, there's so many things, right, that I think we can do, we can look at, we can almost be so immersed in all of this negative data stuff that it can feel maybe overwhelming at times of like, how do we address everything? How do you see the PLC at Work framework really being an anchor for addressing a lot of the things that the research uncovered here?
Hi, this is Leah popping in to share this episode's freebie, a set of reproducibles and a study guide at the Solution Tree. You can find it at the blog post for this episode, www.lindsaybethlyons.com/171. Now back to the show.
Uncovered here.
It puts the main thing as the main thing. And we can avoid the external distractions and the self-inflicted wounds. The external distractions, I like to appeal to lawmakers and decision makers. I mean, how much research do you need to see that test-based student accountability and comparison of schools and districts has been a miserable failure? Stop. For 2 years, we didn't do it. And nobody died. Nobody, you know, schools didn't like explode because they didn't take all these standardized tests. And there's nothing wrong with test-based feedback. The government does have a right to gather evidence on how their citizens are doing. But would it make sense if they did that with fire departments or police departments and gave them letter grades? Wouldn't you want every fire department to be great? Wouldn't you want every police department to be great? The evidence is really clear. It's just a new form of Jim Crow. It's taking these ideas and covering them under the idea of school quality, and it's debilitating certain systems, and it's making some systems think that they're performing better than they really are. So it hurts schools on all parts of the spectrum. Student learning and the actual acquisition of knowledge and skills is what I'm asking the federal, state, and local governments to focus on. I'm asking us to get back to a foundation of how do we improve teacher quality, teacher performance through collaborative teams, that we're not competing with each other. There's these really serious skills and knowledge that kids have to ascertain or gain. How do we work together to get there? And I can learn from you, you can learn from me, and we'll save talking about field day or hat policy or after school program for another team. But give teachers time and space to work on student learning, make the main thing, and allow them to work as a real team and utilize one another, especially since we have so many alternatively certified folks going into the profession. We have to accelerate their growth because they're coming in at a deficit. Wouldn't it be smart for them to be on a strong collaborative team as opposed to trying to figure it out by themselves and an administrator walking in with a walkthrough protocol and telling them how bad they are? They don't have any direction on how to get better. The evidence is just so crystal clear that it gets frustrating when people can't see the writing on the wall. Student by student, skill by skill, collaborative teams, with time, resources, and support to get the job done.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I love all of this. And I think a lot of leaders listen to this podcast. And so I think that structural piece of just where do we have that time built into Teacher School Day? How do we get teachers in each other's rooms to see how things are happening? And, oh, I have that student in my class too. Wow, they're really engaging in your class. How is that happening? What are you doing? Right. I think there's so much that we can do structurally that really enables teachers to thrive, trust teachers that they have the motivation to thrive, and really increases that job satisfaction, which, is going to make them want to keep going.
Absolutely. And even if we are struggling, give them support to help them grow to meet it. It doesn't have to be punitive or negative. That if you give an assessment and most of the kids struggle, what can I do to help you, to help them get there? So the trust is mutual between the leadership and the teachers, but their focus collectively is on students.
I love that. I love that specific example of, every kid fails the assessment, right? There's so many, that's such a learning opportunity. There's so many things that we can dig into. Maybe the assessment was flawed, right? Maybe we give them different ways to demonstrate their learning. Maybe we go back and have it be more student-centered and try this pedagogy, right? Like I love seeing that as a learning opportunity and not a failure of this teacher shouldn't be teaching or something, right?
Absolutely. Because I ask leaders, those are listening, who are you going to replace her with? Nobody's going into teaching. You're better off cultivating the ones you have instead of trying to separate capable from incapable. Help them develop and grow, and they'll stay. They'll be satisfied. They'll get the intrinsic satisfaction of seeing students develop. And just create a much more pleasant system and a much more pleasant environment.
Absolutely. And I think now that we're thinking structurally as well, I wanted you to share, if you could, a little bit about the time for change framework that you developed with Luis Cruz. And I just, there's so much I love about this. It really speaks to my heart. There's a ton of like surveys and rubrics and a bunch of stuff in the appendix that is so usable, like user friendly, ready to go. People can pick up this book and just use something tomorrow, which I really love. And I also love, I think at the very beginning of you introducing it in this book, you talked about how Reeves and Ager, I think, found that change can happen in 100 days. We don't need to wait for like the 3 to 5 years that we often say, right? Like, let's go now. And I love that so much. It's really a nice call to action. Like, we don't need to, Paul Gorski calls it something like pacing for something like comfort or something. And it's right. We don't need to slow this down because we're uncomfortable with like getting things moving. We can get things moving.
Absolutely. Well, the last chapter of the book really is a call to action. And the first thing that I recommend that people do, and we've been saying this for years, is to put together a leadership team. Some call it an instructional leadership team. We call it a guiding coalition. I don't care what you call it, but to have a team whose focus is to support teacher teams in the full implementation of the PLC at work process. And I add in the book rubrics for each one of the 6 essential PLC elements for the leadership team to do an analysis of where they are as an institution as it pertains as we go from novice to exemplary. Wherever you find that you need to greatly improve, let's say it's formative assessment. You have good teams, they do a pretty good job on guaranteed and viable, but as you analyze the rubric, you find that your teachers are really reluctant about collectively developing assessments to use the evidence formatively. There's a fear of comparison or whatever. So there's a survey so you can gather that information from it. And I include as a decision-making framework something that Dr. Luis Cruz and I developed from a book called Time for Change, which is really rooted in behavioral science. And the premise is all human beings love improvement, but we don't necessarily love change. Because change is inconvenient, it's uncomfortable. But people tend to engage if they're given the right equipment. And some of the things that make people reluctant to engage, we break them down from more of a anthropological perspective. We start with a meeting of the minds. So if teachers are not engaged in common formative assessments, maybe they don't understand why it's so important. Maybe there wasn't an intellectual discourse that they might think is just an imposition of power or authority. Maybe they don't understand the research around the power of common assessments. Maybe they don't understand what the benefit and structure that common assessments can bring. So maybe it's poor communication. So maybe we need to shore it up there. Others, it could be emotional. They get it, but there's fear. Will the results be weaponized? Will I get a bad evaluation if Lindsay's kids do better than mine? So it could be trust. It might not be intellectual at all. Maybe they don't trust how we're going to use this evidence, and there's a sense of fear. So the second thing that we place is that if you've already communicated properly and there's not a misunderstanding, maybe there's an emotional gap. We call it a meeting of the heart, and that's building trust. If they get it, they trust, maybe their apprehension is they don't know how to do it. It could be a real skill deficit. Maybe they don't know how to write a good assessment. Maybe they don't know what to do with the data. In our framework, that's the easiest or the most straightforward of the breaches. It's just, I just don't know how to do it. And the premise is if people know better, then they'll do better. So maybe the leadership team looks at it and says, maybe these teachers just need more training on how to develop a common assessment, how to use the data, how to help the students reflect on their own mistakes. If you do those three things, our evidence has shown, you've covered the vast majority of the reasons people resist change. But then there's this last level, which is just defiance. They understand, they trust, they know how to do it, but they've drawn a line in the sand and they've said, you can't make me. So the last tool in our framework is accountability. Now, the best part of accountability is peer pressure. If you develop strong teams, and I'm the outlier, and we're on a team, Lindsay, and the other 3 team members saying, come on, Anthony, we really need you on board. So creating a culture of peer pressure can be improved at the team level. But there's that last level of accountability. If the team has tried everything they know, but Anthony's just being a jerk, for lack of a better term. Somebody on that team, primarily an administrator, if you've tried all the other stages, has to go to Anthony because he's holding up the team's progress. And they have to say, at this point, Anthony, you know why it's necessary. Trust is not an issue. You know how to do it. The rest of your team is doing it. What's wrong with this picture? At this point, I'm not asking you, I'm demanding. And I'm going to use my authority to push you into better practice, not because I hate you or I'm trying to be malicious, that your kids can't wait another day for you to somehow intrinsically, have this epiphany and to join. And you're going to get my full attention until you do. So we produce in the book a framework that leadership teams can use as they're looking at the continuum of implementing fully all 6 of those PLC types and using the time for change framework that where there's a breach, we can act with better communication. Or is it a trust gap? Is it capacity? Or are people just being stubborn? And you're going to catch everybody with 1 or more of those 4.
I love that. It almost makes my next question obsolete. I wonder if it's worth asking, but I was wondering about the biggest challenge that you see. I don't know if they fall maybe into one of those categories, but the biggest challenge you see in terms of implementing this authentically, like fully, the PLC at Work framework and just really thinking about the time for change framework as well from a leader lens.
Well, Dr. Cruz and I in Time for Change, we found that about 90%, this comes from the Transforming School Culture book and study, about 90% is wrapped up in poor communication and lack of trust. Lack of capacity and just stubborn resistance happen a lot less frequently, but they do happen. So a leadership team should focus a lot of their change energy around really, really strong communication and building trust with their faculty. And if those 2 are solid, those other 2 breaches they're less frequent.
That is huge. I think, that's really big number. 90% is shocking to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to be really heartening for a lot of leaders to think, well, that's a lot fewer battles that I have to prepare for. I just need to communicate better. And that's something that I can have a little bit of control over, right? Like I can prepare to do this. Yep. And that must be freeing for people listening. So that's exciting.
Absolutely. And if you communicate and you build trust, then we've seen situations where defiance just was non-existent. Now capacity, that is more concrete. Either I know how to unpack a standard or I don't. And that's situational. But we found that happens a lot less frequently than people who develop bad attitudes and dispositions because of misunderstanding or mistrust.
That's incredible. I think so. We've talked about a lot of things, and your book covers a lot of things. One of the things that I like to offer listeners at the end is just the question of, if there's one thing that someone could do tomorrow. So these ideas are kind of swimming around in their heads, and they're thinking this is a lot of stuff that maybe I need to take in, digest, think about, implement. What's like the one thing I can do to get started tomorrow that'll put me on the right path to doing all this stuff?
Make sure you have a strong, democratically uh, democratic representation on your leadership team. Make sure you have representative democracy. That every grade level or department has a representative leadership, and start to collaborate. Model for your teachers what good collaboration looks like around student learning. I would recommend you get the book The Way Forward and read it as a book study and do some self-analysis so you can get very specific on the work that your school needs to get done. Because your school's needs may be different than the school around the corner. School around the corner may be different than a school in another district. But the PLC at Work framework is concrete enough that if you do that self-analysis, you can tighten it up and make sure that you have evidence in all 6 of those critical areas. So that would be my recommendation. We've rarely found a school improve at scale that they don't have strong leadership teams. Now, where you have a charismatic leader who is kind of that superhero, you'll get results for a while until that person leaves. You want sustained leadership, you want sustained growth, it needs to be a collective effort. So district office, quit looking for the miracle principles, the lean on me, the stand and deliver, the freedom riders. Just go work together as a team. You don't need a superhero in leadership. You just need a leader that's humble enough to know that he or she can't do it by themselves.
I love that. A lot of my research and work is in shared leadership, inclusive of students as well. So I'm just thinking about the representation on the leadership team too, of people who aren't even educators, but the children that we're there for, right? So I think that's a wonderful idea to be able to start there, and that's something that you could reflect on tomorrow and get to work on tomorrow. Beautiful. I'm wondering, one of the questions I ask for fun at the end usually is just, what's something that you've been either learning about or working on lately? Is there anything new in the works for you or something you're curious about?
I'm learning how to relax. I'm a type A personality. I have 2 books that are already done, another 2 more that I'm doing edits on. And I'm going to take some time to just sit back and enjoy my life's labor and enjoy family. And really, it's one thing to advocate for the benefit of other people, but it seems harder to advocate for my own leisure and benefit. And I'm learning to be more balanced. So I've never read for pleasure. I've always read for information. Informational text is my thing. But I'm learning to get more into narrative text and fictional and just kind of lose myself and take walks on the beach. And so that's my new thing. I want a more balanced life.
That's incredible. And I think a lot of leaders need to hear that because they're probably in similar positions to you and needing that reminder. So I love that you're offering that. Thank you. And the last thing is, people are going to, if they're already probably following you, but people are going to want to follow the work that you're doing, connect with you, see what conferences you're speaking at, all the things. What's the best place online to follow the work you're doing?
For social media, Facebook, I have a page under Dr. Anthony Muhammad, and I have a Twitter or X, whatever they call them these days. I don't use it as often, but that's at New Frontier 21, and I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. If you want resources, books, conferences, solutiontree.com is the best place. You just put in my name, I'll show you all of the PLC institutes I'm speaking at. It has links to all of my books and resources and streaming videos and DVDs. And so that's the best place for resources. To get access to me, social media is the best. And my website's being revamped. That's newfrontier21.com. It won't be up for another month, but check on that in another month, and that'll be a clearinghouse for all of those things.
Awesome. I think by the time this airs, that should be up and running. And so we'll link to all that stuff in the show notes and the blog post for the episode.
Great.
Dr. Muhammad, thank you so much for your time today. This was an absolute joy.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. And you were a great interview. So thank you.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsayBethLyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at teachbetter.com/podcasts, and we'll see you at the next episode.